Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, this afternoon for a very important conversation. My name is Jane Herring. I am the President and CEO of World Affairs Council of Orange County, one of over 90 different independent councils throughout the country dedicated to keeping our communities engaged on matters of world affairs and how they affect us locally. We are really glad that you are here with us and very proud to present this presentation. Our speakers today are Ferdinando Nando Guerra. He's the senior global economist and senior geopolitical analyst with the Port of Long Beach, part of the busiest port complex in the nation and the Western Hemisphere. He has 25 years of experience working in the three largest metro area economies in the nation, New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, working in economic development with the largest county economic development agency in the nation and one of the largest city economic development agencies, conducting economic and geopolitical research and analysis, export promotion, foreign direct investment attraction, consulting, lecturing, and formulating public policy, amongst many other accolades. Moderating this discussion this afternoon is William Bill Edwards, a past chairman of the World Affairs Council of Orange County and a wonderful human being. We're very glad to have them both here this afternoon. Please keep in mind that towards the end of this webinar, all questions are welcome. Please put them in the Q&A portion of this Zoom webinar. And we welcome everyone to participate, be a part of this conversation, and of course, join our membership if you are willing. Thank you very much and welcome Ferdinando and Bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. I'm going to moderate and at the same time make a presentation today. This is my 51st year of doing international business, and I've lived in 7 countries and worked on projects in over 50. And this is one of the most interesting times of my entire career. And you can tell that from the title of our webinar called Ports, Politics, and the Price of Trade. The ports are the front line of trade where cost and delays directly reflect global pressures. Politics and policies shape these outcomes, impacting prices we all feel. Today, Nando and I are going to connect the realities of the ports that we all know locally to broader global economic and business challenges. So first of all, I'm going to turn it over to my friend Nando, who's going to address the local ports, their impact on business, not just locally, but in our country. And this is from his perspective as the senior global economist for the Port of Long Beach. Nando, over to you.
Thank you so much, Bill. Let me share my screen and my slides. Can everyone see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So let me start by saying thank you very much to Jane and all the leadership at the Orange County World Affairs Council, along with Bill, obviously, and thanks to Ella for helping out and all the interns and everything that you guys do. Want to thank Bill and in particular and say it's truly an honor to be able to have the opportunity to do a webinar like this with Bill Edwards. We go way back a few years now, and I remember, and it's just extraordinary to see how times have changed. And I've worked very closely with the Southern California District Export Council and people like Bill, and we've always been advocating for free trade and increasing economic and commercial ties. And it's just amazing how far we've come from 2012 and 2015 with the TPP, and really how that was the turning point. So my main objective today with every presentation that I do or speech is to ensure that you learn something new, and that is value added. So and ultimately for everyone to fully understand the role that the Port of Long Beach and the Port of LA, for that matter, obviously, play in our economy and how vital they are to our regional economy, state economy, and national economies, and for that matter, the global economy as well. So this is the agenda and what I will be covering over the next 20 minutes or so, and I will try to be as fast as I can to save hopefully a good sufficient amount of time for questions. So I'm just going to start briefly with a little bit of a Port of Long Beach 101 and tariffs 101 and the impact that those tariffs have had on our port and overall the San Pedro Bay Port Complex so far. And then get into the heart and what I'm here today really to focus on is the fact that we have just completed conducting a economic impact and fiscal impact analysis and what those impacts are to the regional economy, state economy, and national economies, and then get into obviously the results of those analysis, this study, and then of course the key findings. So real quickly, a little bit about the Port of Long Beach. We are part of the busiest port complex in the nation and in the Western Hemisphere. Of course, Port of LA being number one, Port of Long Beach being number two, adjacent to each other. And we really like to look at it in terms of one port complex. Over $300 billion in annual trade. Last year was a record year in the 114-year history of the Port of Long Beach, with 9.6 million containers being moved through the port. And that equates, and I will obviously be focusing and getting into these numbers in greater detail, into over 2.7 million jobs nationally. So why are the ports of LA and Long Beach the busiest in the nation? Let's start real quickly with that. And it all starts, of course, in 2001 with China joining the World Trade Organization. And we have gone from about 4.5 million container TEUs to 9.6 million over that 24-year period. So it more than doubled. And of course, the big thing to understand there is 68% of our containerized imports come from China. So if there is any particular port that has the most to gain, like we have over the past 24 years, or the most to lose as a result of this trade war with China, and we'll see what happens, and I'll touch upon that later. Now we have a November deadline of what those tariffs will be, and we have another extension, luckily, and we're not at that 145% because that would have been extremely damaging to our port in particular. Not so much, less so for the Port of LA. So the reason is because of it's the most direct route from Asia, in particular China, to not only Southern California and the southwestern region of the US, but the entire US. And we are the port to everywhere because we offer the fastest, most direct gateway for goods moving to and from Asia. We can get to places like Columbus, Ohio, or anywhere else in the Midwest, the Ohio Valley, or other parts of the country in 9 days, 9 days faster than the Panama Canal all-water route. So I'm putting this slide up to basically pose these questions for you. And at the end of the presentations, at the end of Bill's presentation, we'll open it up for questions. And if there are any questions here that you do not know the answer to, please feel free to ask those questions. And of course, any other questions you may have as a result of going through both of our presentations. But I thought these are some fundamental, of course, I understand you might know the answer to the majority of these questions, but there are some, I'm sure, that you would love to have more information and detail about. So what has happened so far as a result of these tariffs? And again, understanding and prefacing with the fact that we are coming off a record year last year, 9.6 million TEUs. And part of that is actually related to of course, the leading up to the election in November, and really started last August, where companies, as a result of what President Trump was campaigning on and what he was proposing with respect to tariffs, is a lot of companies started what we call front loading, bringing in goods and obviously adding to their inventories even leading up to the election. And of course, since November, we have seen that consistently up until basically April, when we had the big announcement of the Liberation Day and the reciprocal tariffs. So, as a result of what was announced in April, and as a result of what has taken place with particular threats, and we saw in May and in June, as we expected, a decline and significant declines in cargo, of course, in particular imports. In July, we just got the numbers about a week and a half ago. We saw a 7% increase, and it's a record July in our history and the third best month in history. The Port of LA actually saw their best month in their entire history in the month of July. So year to date, we've seen about a 10% year over, these are all year over year percentages, and the outlook is for a 10% decline over the rest of 2025, essentially equating it to a flat year of volume. Now, the real question mark is going forward and beyond, obviously, into 2026. But for now, the goods, relatively speaking, the good news is we have this further 90-day extension into November, which is going to help inevitably the August, September, and October numbers. And of course, these May, June, and July numbers would be very different. If obviously the 145% total tariff on China remained at those levels. Now, let me get into what I really am here today to focus on the most, and that is, what is the economic and fiscal impact of the Port of Long Beach, and only the Port of Long Beach, not both ports. And this project is undertaken every few years. Last study was done in 2017 using 2017 data. This time, and this was just completed a couple of months ago, it's utilizing 2023 data. So the key point here to remember is in 2017, we moved 7.5 million containers. In 2023, we moved about 8 million. And again, to repeat, last year was 9.6 million. So this analysis was conducted based on that 8 million, not the 9.6 million. So these numbers would be higher. And that's what we've seen over the years. Every few years, whenever this is conducted, of course, the more container traffic, the more higher volumes leads to greater economic impacts and fiscal impacts. So this analysis, in my opinion, of course, in particular, this time around, is much more valuable. And the reason is because what these numbers demonstrate is essentially, what do we really have at stake when we do pursue policies like we are currently pursuing in the form of these tariffs, right? And inevitably, undoubtedly, we will see a decline in traffic, in container traffic, and that will lead to negative economic and fiscal impacts. So let me get into a little bit about what actually is happening with this analysis. Company called EBP, a consultant that we hired for this, and I was a project manager. There are three different economic impacts that we are estimating: the direct effects, the indirect effects, and the induced effects. And if I have time, I'll come back and get into the detail, of what that exactly means. But I think it's more important to focus on the numbers instead of necessarily the methodology or how this all works. So here is the first slide I'm going to get into with respect to the numbers. This is just looking at the results of the employment impacts, okay? And what are those impacts? And what we did is we looked at 4 different areas, starting with the LA Metropolitan Statistical Area, which is LA County and Orange County. Then we looked at the 5-county, in addition to Riverside, San Bernardino, and Ventura County, so the 5-county Southern California region. Then, of course, at the state level and at the national level. And as you can see here, the numbers are extremely impressive, and it's so important in this environment and at this time for all of us, for the policymakers, for our communities, for all of Southern California. And in particular, of course, I want to focus on Orange County, being the Orange County World Affairs Council. how much of an impact the Port of Long Beach and what happens at our ports has on our regional economy. So here is a graphic that shows you when we say economic impacts and fiscal impacts, what are we talking about? Of course, on the economic side of things, it's looking at jobs, employment, the incomes that are generated as a result of those jobs. And we're talking about high paying jobs on average relative to other industries. And then, of course, we're looking at the regional GDP or state or national GDP. So that value added, that gross product, and then the overall total economic output. And then from the fiscal side of things, we look at the federal and state and local taxes that are generated as a result of everything that is happening at our port. And again, you can see these numbers and how high and how significant they are. Now let's focus in and hone in on the LA MSA, the first region that we analyze, and look at the numbers here. And first, let me point out, to put things into proper context and perspective, the LA MSA, which again is LA County and Orange County, is the 18th largest economy in the world. Let me repeat that. California being, of course, the US #1, California fourth largest economy in the world, and LA and Orange County would be the 18th largest economy in the world at over $1 trillion in GDP. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about obviously one of the large, LA County in itself is the largest county economy in the nation. And our port plays a vital and critical role in that economic engine. And it doesn't just touch upon those industries that you would assume it does, obviously, that are directly related with respect to the movement of those goods, right? Being wholesale transportation and warehousing, which together over 122,000 jobs. But you can see here, and this is the case across the United States, where it reverberates and touches every industry across the economy. And retail trade, professional business services, wholesale trade that I mentioned, and of course, transportation. Next, these next three slides, I'll look at it from a geographical and for, the political geography of all of this to really emphasize how far-reaching the impacts are. So in California, we touch and impact every state assembly district and every state Senate district. And it's so important for our policymakers to understand this, starting regionally, but also across the state, and then, of course, nationally. Now, this slide essentially shows you all of the counties, over 3,000 counties in the United States, and we impact roughly 99% of all U.S. counties. And as you can see here, it's not just California, right, that is obviously utilizing the Port of Long Beach, but Texas, New York, Illinois, Colorado. So the key for us is being able to maintain that cargo, that discretionary cargo, what we call essentially everything east of the Rocky Mountains, is being able to still serve those areas is so critical for our long-term prosperity as a port and as a port complex, is holding on to that market share. Right. And you can see here, we literally impact every metro area economy in the nation. And then finally, to put things into full context, is we literally impact every congressional district in the United States. In those areas where you see white here, there's still, in between $0 and $5 million of trade taking place. So we are absolutely a vital engine I'm not sure why the numbers are not coming up here, but I'll give you a breakdown. 2.7 million jobs, 1.2 million in retail trade, and then 432,000 in goods movement, 430,000 professional and financial services. So again, across the board, and you can see here, and then we have the national impacts fueling growth as well. Again, looking at contribution to GDP, the fiscal impacts, economic output, which is the business sales or business revenues, and labor income. And then finally, the key overall findings. And of course, I have the LAMSA, which you are most interested in, of course, highlighted in yellow. And it's so critical to understand this. 1 out of every 17 jobs can be attributed to what is happening at our port. Okay. And then over 68 billion with respect to contributions to the gross product, and then over 20 billion in taxes generated. So our port is a vital part of our regional, state, and national economies in multiple ways. And it's very important to understand how much is really at stake with respect to current U.S. trade policy. And if we continue down this road over the longer term, beyond 2028, of keeping these tariffs in place, and remember, in January, our overall effective tariff rate was 2%, and it is now 18%. And that is the highest since 1934 when you go back to the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. And that's a whole nother webinar. We can hopefully have that opportunity one day to talk about where we are. And as Bill mentioned earlier, of how transformational and how historic this moment really is. So with that said, I will now stop sharing and I will hand it over to my good friend, Bill Edwards.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to have those particular stats from the port of Long Beach. I think it really is important for everybody that's around here to know the impact the port has. When you showed me your slides, it was amazing to me that we impact every county in the country and every congressional district. That's even probably more important. Okay, I'm going to now to segue a bit and move away from the ports and get a little bit more macro and look at some of the information that shows where we are as a country doing business today. So here's some trends that we're seeing in doing global business today. Geopolitical risk, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Obviously, the regional conflicts, wars, sanctions, nationalism, all those things are leading companies to really reconsider which countries they do business in and how they operate. Obviously, there's trade disruption, the tariffs, shifting alliances, there's reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, all of those are changing the landscape of trade and causing companies to reconfigure their supply chains. Customer preference shifts. Tastes are evolving faster than ever, especially among digital native consumers. We need to have flexibility in our branding for restaurant brands, which we export a lot of. Menu offerings have to be changed, and how we engage with customers has to change, not just in the States, but everywhere. And then, of course, there's AI. Automation, AI, and digital platforms, those used to be something that people thought about. If your company doesn't have that today, they're not competitive with the other companies in the world. Localization pressure. This is an interesting one. My company exports U.S. brands into other countries, and we often find that governments and consumers in other countries want local content. They want culturally adapted brands. And then, of course, and the one that we all look at closely is regulatory complexity. This means things from licensing to standards to data privacy. The regulatory frameworks are changing and doing nothing but getting more challenging when we're trying to do business. So all this adds up to uncertainty and a need to be extremely flexible when doing business around the world today. As I mentioned when we first started, this is my 51st year of doing international business, and it's always been interesting to do international business. And it's always been something you needed to be flexible, but today more than ever. So now let's look at some charts. Some of you know that I publish a global business update newsletter every 2 weeks, and it primarily consists of charts that I find in publications. Now, this is a really interesting one. Geopolitical risk and index. And what is this? By the way, this is the number of articles that discuss adverse geopolitical risk in leading English language newspapers around the world. 100 is kind of normal and calm. Anything above 100 is more activity going on. If you look way back in 1920, there was World War One, and 1940 World War Two, and of course there was geopolitical risk then. The next time you come up is about 2008, where we had the financial collapse around the world. And then it kind of calmed down, but notice what's happening in 25. It's beginning to tip back up again, and I don't think that surprises anyone. One of the things that I look at very closely is business confidence, or what do business people think about the world that they live in today. And this is an index from the NFIB, which is an association of small businesses. And every month they poll their tens of thousands of small business members and say, how are you feeling about the economy? How are you feeling about doing business? Now, anything above 50 is positive. And you can see for the last few years, we've been percolating along in the low 90s. Note that the 52-year average is in the high 90s. And then in the first few months of this year, when we had the new administration come in, things were okay. But look what's happened in the last month. More confidence in the future. I think that's something that we'll see an impact in the economy in the next year or so. Well, now, while we're with charts that have lines on them, this is the Global Supply Chain Pressure Index. I know you're all excited about that. Basically, what this does is it tracks shipping costs, delivery times, bottlenecks at ports, at Nando's ports. And while some pressures have eased since the pandemic, the system is vulnerable to various types of political shocks, energy price spikes, tariff changes, port disruptions. All of those drive this curve up, and up is not good. You want to get as close to zero as possible, which means that supply chain pressure is fairly substantial right now. And that is not a surprise considering what Nando showed you as far as from one month to another, whether we have more containers or less containers coming into the port. Well, now let's deal with the tariffs, okay? We had to get to those in this presentation at some point in time. The blue chart is what the average tariffs that U.S. put on these countries, which are our primary trading partners, in 2024. And look at 2025. Obviously, these are gigantic differences. China, by the way, is showing at 30. It's been as high as 154 this year, and it's been as low as 30. Right now, it's sort of on hold at 30. Vietnam shows as 40. What that actually is that anything that's transshipped into Vietnam, say from China, and then remanufactured and sent to the States, has a 40% tariff. If it's manufactured entirely in Vietnam, it's 20%. But look at the difference between 20% and a couple of percent in 2024. India just got a real interesting surprise. It was 25%, but because they're importing so much Russian oil, it's been increased to 50%. And it was about 4% in 2024. So you can see there's just immense difference in the cost to bring a product or service in to the United States this year than last year. And then this is one of my favorite charts. This says what these various countries or regions are sending into the U.S. or importing from the U.S. So the European Union, which is 27 countries, It has about 600 billion last year of exports and about 400 billion imports. Now, if you look at Mexico and Canada, they're over $1 trillion of imports and not that much, about half of that of exports. So the orange is how much has been imported into the country, and the blue is how much has been exported from our country. You can see we really are a very much net importer. Now, here's a real impact. You heard Nando talk about the changes in containers coming into the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach in month to month this year. What this is this is for the period of April through June. The change on a year ago of the amount of the money amount of exports that came from these countries to the U.S. From China, and so there were more exports from China to Vietnam than last year, substantial. But look what happened in the U.S. Look at the decline, $30 billion less imports from China in a 3-month period this year than last year. This is a little bit complicated, but it's one of the more interesting things that's happening in the world. Probably a lot of you didn't know that we import a lot of our beef from Australia. A lot of the beef that you get in your grocery store comes from Australia. And we have now a current tariff with Australia, I believe, is 10%. But you'll notice that in the imports in tons have been going up dramatically in the last few years. And that even after you put the tariff on, that we end up with a lower price for the beef at our grocery store from Australia and then New Zealand than we do with domestic beef. And that's because we have a supply deficit in domestic beef. So this is very interesting because a lot of us don't realize that a lot of the beef we eat is from Australia. Now I'm going to address something that's totally different than tariffs. And these are what's called non-tariff barriers. These are restrictions that countries put on products and services from the United States because they want to limit the amount of imports from our country. So they might put a quote on. They might say you can only ship this much beef or this much of a product or this much chips into our country. And then there's product standards. It says the standards you have to meet are different in our country than in your country. The subsidies down there at the bottom. Now, subsidies are where the government in a country is subsidizing the local business so that they can compete with other countries. And the classic case of this is China. China heavily subsidizes their car industry, primarily their electronic vehicle industry, so that the cars are much cheaper than they would be without a subsidy. And we have to compete against that. Over on the right there are custom delays. That's where you're trying to get a U.S. product into a country and the government delays it. And in some cases, in the case of food, they'll delay it so long that the food meets its expiration date. So what does all this mean and key takeaways today from ports, politics, and the price of trade? And this is a kind of a summary of Nando's incredible research. He is the chief global economist, by the way. And the stats that you saw in the charts that we've just looked at. So global trade has always been volatile in my 51 years of doing international business, but it's more volatile than it's ever been. And it's shaped by geopolitics and by shifting alliances between countries. It's not shaped just by the product and service costs, but politics. Politics do impact where the product goes and how much of it goes from one place to another. Nando talked to you about ports and shipping, and you know what the ports are? The ports are the first indication of what's happening in global business. We watch the ports of Long Beach and LA very closely to see what's coming in and what's going out. And that's telling us what's there is in the way of tariffs, but it's also telling us how much people want products from other countries. I think the number is about 40% of all imports and exports into and out of the United States come through our two ports, 40% from those two ports. So watching what happens in those ports as far as the number of containers tells us what the business activity is inside the United States. And that activity can signal whether we have disruption or problems. Confidence, consumer confidence, and executive sentiment confidence today reflect growing uncertainty overall. And uncertainty is really not something we like to live with in international business. We typically, in international business, once we know what the playing field is, we figure out how to work with it. But it's when things are constantly changing that we have a challenge doing business. Supply chains were immensely impacted during COVID. The pressures have eased a bit, but they're vulnerable to shocks. If there's a dramatic change from one month to another in what we can export, like chips, and where we can export them to, or what the tariff is for bringing something in, it dramatically changes the supply chain, which means that businesses have a really difficult time projecting their revenues for a year. Now, we went and talked a little bit about non-tariff barriers. I call these hidden costs. They're very often higher than the tariffs are. I remember years ago taking an American restaurant brand into China, and we needed to import the sauces because the sauces were proprietary. And the Chinese government decided that they didn't like the color of one of the additives in one of the bottles that we were shipping. And they held up the entire shipment for 6 months until we could figure out a solution. That is a non-tariff barrier. But then we go to resilience, and one of my favorite words, adaptability is key to navigating uncertainty. Bottom line, global trade is really at a crossroads. Ports, politics, and policies, the name that Jane came up with for this webinar, really drive the cost of doing business and the risk of doing business. And one of the things I'd like to mention to you is that this is not just something in general, this global business. Notice that almost every county in this country is impacted on what happens in our ports. So our ports, politics, and policies impact our entire country. But resilience, being adaptable, and cooperating between countries is going to determine who thrives in tomorrow's interconnected economy. Okay, we're back together. Nando, are you with me?
Yes, I am.
I don't see any questions.
I
So we'll be very happy to take questions. If somebody come up with, we still have about 15 minutes. And Nando, maybe you'd like to make some comments based on all the stats you saw.
Yes, no, and I also can bring up the slide I had up with particular
Please,
questions.
please do.
I think that would be,
Please do.
especially if we don't have any. Okay. So the tariffs 101, I guess just to quickly, and I know the audience is obviously well informed and following things closely and have a good understanding, but just in case, with respect to what tariffs really are, and unfortunately, I would love for us to be able to stop saying the word tariff and instead say tax, because they are a tax on imports. And in particular, they are regressive taxes. And what does that mean? Which means they negatively impact the lowest income brackets the most. And that I think is, that's where this is really going to get down to the politics, I think, starting next year's midterms and then, of course, in 2028 and beyond, whether or not these tariffs will stay in place. But just to debunk one of the great myths that we've been hearing for the last 10 years, is who pays for these tariffs. And Bill knows better than anyone that it is the actual importers that pay the tariffs. And the biggest importer in the United States is Walmart. And it's just a matter of time before that company will pass on those additional costs, as Bill was talking about. What this all translates into is a lower bottom line unless you can pass those costs on in the form of higher prices. And that we will be seeing. I can guarantee you that. We might have not necessarily seen it so much yet, and that's because of all the front loading that I mentioned and all the buildups in the inventory. But in a couple of months, we will see that come to fruition, and we're already seeing that in the data, the various inflation data. But I think the big one that came out a couple of weeks ago was the producer price index, and that's the wholesale prices, and that was up a significant amount. And we will see that then, of course, there's that lag effect, and we will start seeing it for sure in the fourth quarter and into 2026. And then, then you get into the entire debate about obviously what the Fed should be doing next. And that's going to be, very interesting as well. And then, of course, we've seen the impacts it's had on the labor market as well over May, June, and July. Really dismal numbers. And so there's that aspect of as well. And ultimately, the big question mark, right, for all economists right now is, are we on the precipice of a recession, right? And the consensus is no, but there are some high-profile economists out there who I highly respect, like Mark Zandi from Moody's, who's saying we are. And all of this is self-inflicted. These policies are by choice. And let's remember where we were economically coming into 2025. And again, any of these questions, if anyone would like them,
okay. Nando, we now have questions.
We
now have questions. So here's one for you. Given the increased uncertainty of the rollout of these tariffs, uncertainty is a really good word. What are some of the responses you've been giving to reinsure nervous investors?
I think the main message.
I'm going to let you answer this one, Nando.
In all honesty, the main message really has been coming out of from executive management from the Port of Long Beach is that R word that you had in your slide, Bill, and that's resiliency. And we've the port has always done whatever it's taken to get through whatever crisis, whether it was back in 08, 09, or of course what we saw happen as a result of the pandemic and the global supply chain crisis. And that we'll get through this, and we will do everything that we can to ensure that we maintain certain levels based on why importers choose to use the ports of LA and Long Beach to begin with,
Yeah.
right?
If I could comment, I tell the viewers, go to the Port of Long Beach website. There is an immense amount of information, detailed information about trade there, not just the number of containers, but about trade. Another one, Nando, says, please comment on the Panama Canal Zone and what impact that has on our ports.
Yes, absolutely. We actually saw that last year, and the major drought that was taking place, and limiting the amount of volumes that could go through the canal, and how we then benefited as a result of that. Let me go bring up this other slide that I have as well, which shows, right, there's so if there are less ships utilizing particularly the Trans-Pacific to get to the Gulf Coast or the East Coast through via the Panama Canal, if there are any issues, disruptions there, then we are the beneficiary of that. And I think that's very important to understand and to point out. One other thing I want to point out real quickly is that we are almost done. Hopefully it'll be in October, where we're working on both ports, the 25-year long-term cargo forecast. And that is probably the most important analysis that we conduct and document that we have produced, because it's the underlying foundation to everything that we do, particularly in planning, right? Obviously, over the long term. Now, with that said, right, it's never been more difficult to conduct something like that, a forecast, because of all of the uncertainty. And the big question mark will be, will these tariffs stay in place? And the first question becomes, and we're going to see probably by next month, are they legal even to begin with? And then things will really get interesting, with when we have that determination. But going forward, and this is where the politics comes in, of course. Will this be something that will be continued to be pursued over the longer term? Or will it obviously depend on which administration comes to power? So it's going to be, and we have obviously, as a result of my presentation and really explaining and understanding the significance of that cargo activity and what that translates into from an economic and fiscal standpoint, if we lose a substantial amount as a result of these protectionist policies, particularly with China, what will that mean and what will that translate into over that longer term? And so that's obviously what we are so concerned about. And I know in your years of experience, like you pointed out, and in my 25 years of experience, these are truly extraordinary times. And it's going to be, I think it's so important to have forums like this to educate the public about the benefits of trade, right? And understanding that, and then of course, debunking these myths and sticking to the economics of this and not the politics, right? Economically, is this beneficial or not moving forward?
Well, that brings up a question that we've got a lot of questions now. Are there
Great.
any benefits to the increased tariffs with our international trading partners, such as increased federal revenue to reduce the national deficit or providing the U.S. with strategic positions for negotiating with foreign governments?
So great question. And unfortunately, don't have a lot of time to really get into the details of being able to properly answer this. But this goes back to what I was just saying and what we're hearing so far from some of the bigger organizations like Oxford Economics and Standard and Poor's and others, that these tariffs will most likely stay in place because politically they will be advantageous, because the emphasis will be on the revenues that are being created. And over the next decade, we're talking up to $3 trillion in potential revenues. And yes, I get it, and I understand how important that is, especially with respect to what was just passed with the big, beautiful bill and the over $4 trillion in additional debt that is going to create over the next decade as well. So to mitigate that, and I think that's one of the key reasons why we're seeing this, right? And going back to the question mark of why is this happening, right? Now, with that said, there's the whole counter, all right, argument with respect to, yes, though, but where are those revenues coming from, right? And the average household is going to be hit by roughly $2,500 in additional costs, and that's going to lower our overall economic output and increase inflation. So, at what cost are those additional revenues? And if you look at the net impact, would that actually come out as a real positive? With respect to negotiating, I think I understand it and I get it. But at the same time, I think the critical point that I want to make is that economic prosperity and economic security, internet trade and free trade is related to economic prosperity, but it's also related to national security and increasing economic ties and commercial ties with countries like we've seen since the end of World War II, and what that has meant for global stability and peace with respect to, and of course, this being a World Affairs Council, is understanding the relationship between economics and trade and our foreign relations, and how critical that is, especially with going forward with Asia, and the whole ASEAN region as well. And that's why, in my opinion, the TPP was something back, 10 years ago where this reversal in our policy really started. But it's really understanding the full picture always and understanding what those net impacts will be, not just
Okay.
telling one side of the story. And unfortunately,
So
that's the politics.
there's a question for me. Could you share any anecdotes from your work experience in navigating similar periods of high uncertainty, especially a period of high tariffs? I I've been through times of uncertainty. Certainly, COVID was a time of uncertainty where we had immense challenges to supply chain, to buying, consumer trends, and we figured out a way to work around that. The difference between COVID and now, quite honestly, is very simple. In COVID, we figured out what the process was and where we were and what needed to be done. Unfortunately, right now, we're having a lot of changes occur just at the point where we think we've got this figured out. And like I said earlier, once we know the parameters of what we need to do to do business, we figure out a way to make it work worldwide. That's general. Right now, unfortunately, there's the uncertainty is the challenge. We don't know from one month to another what the tariff is going to be from a country. And we also don't know what the policies are going to be. And that is the challenge. And we're trying our best to figure it out. The challenge, quite honestly, is projections, projecting from now in the future. There was another question here. Given the questions about economic development, do you see any projects by the U.S. government agencies to help offset what's going on in the marketplace today as far as business is concerned? Ando, do you see anything along those lines?
Well, unfortunately, I think for us, there are multiple projects, being the environmental stewards that we are, and that great emphasis on being the greenest port in the world. A lot of projects that are not necessarily going to be funded now from the federal standpoint and federal grants because of a change in policy. So we're being not only impacted by the tariffs and how that's going to impact our cargo activity, but also from an environmental standpoint, we have this big, very significant project, long-term Pier Wind project, that it could potentially end up being impacted as a result of the policies of the current administration. If those are continued beyond 2028, that's the real question mark for us.
Well, and then there's a question that really kind of pertains to that. What leverage do ports have against tariffs, or does it all rest on the next election cycle?
Well, of course, like everyone else, we have a government relations department division. And of course, they're advocating, it's one thing to be doing it in Sacramento, and then another thing, of course, to be doing it in Washington. And I think what executive management from both ports has clearly stated, obviously, you determine what you want to do. We can't impact that, influence that. But at the end of the day, all we're asking for is that what are things going to be? So there is that certainty. What is that tariff going to be? So we know that, and then we can move forward. And I think that's what the biggest ask every time they go to DC is being able to, at the very least, do that without necessarily having the ability to really influence what they're doing with respect to trade policy.
And that's the reason why in my business, I look very carefully at surveys of consumers around the world and surveys of executives around the world to see what their attitude is about going forward. And it's up and down, but I must tell you that overall it's up. And I think that's because we just as human beings try to figure out a way to make everything work. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to our president and CEO, Jane Herring. And we're just about to come up on the top of the hour. Jane, over to you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Nando. When people ask me why I'm a part of the World Affairs Councils of Orange County, and before this, other councils across the country, there's over 90 of us. Like I said previously, we're all independent in terms of governance and financials, but we all have a similar mission, and that's keeping everybody in our communities engaged with the world. But honestly, the biggest reason I'm a part of a council like this is so I can have relationships with people like Nando and Bill. We are all having conversations like this every day. And if you would like to be a part of this, join our membership, come to a program. If you are not quite sure how you want to be involved, but just want to continue the conversation, reach out. We're here. We are here for this very reason, and especially during times of uncertainty. We are a glue that keeps our community engaged and aware of what's going on. And whatever the barrier is to being a part of that you're struggling with, please reach out. We have opportunities for you, I promise. So on that note, I'll just let you know about a few other programs that we have coming up. The next in-person program we have coming up right here in Newport Beach, actually. We have Ambassador Gaddy Vasquez, who is the former director of the Peace Corps, joined by a current trustee of our organization who's was a senior manager of USAID, along with a dear friend of mine who is on the global public health stage, Council Foreign Relations, and trying to prevent the next pandemic. We'll be doing a panel on why humanitarian aid is so important, especially in its role as soft power. After that, we have many more programs in the works. We have one with a lifelong career Pentagon person who would like to share with you his recent research on the mind technology connection when it comes to defense that we may be doing in combination with UCI's medicine and their similar research on the mind technology connection when it comes to medicine. We also have a program coming up honoring legacy of JFK's administration when it comes to the non-aligned movement, what we now call the Global South. We have programs on preventing genocide, but also fun membership gatherings. It's not all doom and gloom, I promise. But just please be engaged, be aware. Our biggest enemy is not other parties, but apathy. So we look forward to welcoming you at the next programs. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Nando. Thank you, our team internally that put this together. We look forward to welcome you all. This program will be on YouTube following this.